welcome to the Great Women in Compliance podcast with Hema Lomax and me, Lisa Fine. We're sponsored by Corporate Compliance Insights. Today's episode is a roundtable, and Ellen Hunt is joining and mostly leading the discussion. Thank you so much for that, Ellen. And it's about working overseas and coming back home. So have you thought about that? Today's topic is about what would you need to do when you want to be an expat? And then on the other side of the coin, what you should know about being a repat or coming back home. We're excited to have two compliance experts joining our roundtable today. Joy Hayes just recently took a position in Switzerland at Trafigura in lovely Geneva, Switzerland. And I'm hoping I say that, but Trafigura is a leading supplier of metals and minerals, oil and petroleum products, and gas and powder. They have investments in renewable energy and low carbon, hydrogen, and clean energy technologies, which is just a fascinating, hugely growing area. And Joy works with a global team of compliance professionals to measure the effectiveness of program efforts and to work into continuous improvement and keep growing and improving a compliance program. Gitanjali Sakhuja is the Associate General Counsel for AmeriCares in Washington, D.C. Before coming back to the United States, she was the head of global compliance for Svidder in Copenhagen, where she lived for almost 5 years. Hopefully, if I mangled anything in that introduction, you all will correct it. So Joy, can you just start by talking about your career path, and then Gitanjali will jump over to you.
Sure, that sounds great. Yeah, so I actually started in a really non-traditional way for somebody in our field. I started out as an academic. I earned my PhD in ethics and I taught college. And then I just saw an opportunity to make a stronger impact with my particular skill set in a practitioner role. So I started out by doing some consulting, largely with small global nonprofits. But then I jumped at the opportunity to move in-house because it afforded me the opportunity to develop solutions that fit the risks and cultures of the particular organizations that I supported, and to ensure that those solutions land well, that they're sustainable and adaptable based on the changing needs of the organizations. I worked at 2 defense contractors, and then I moved to a video game company, and now I'm at Trafigura.
And Gitanjali, what about you?
Absolutely. So first off, thank you, Ellen and Lisa. It's great to be back on Quick. Thank you so much for having me. Joy and I actually met at a compliance social that I hosted earlier this year, just before she moved to Geneva. And Joy and I have more than compliance in common. We both share having had lived in Geneva, Switzerland. Regarding my career, I started mine in the UN, in the legal field. I've always worked in-house. I worked across both the United Nations Development Program and UNICEF, as well as a number of other NGOs. I've had the great fortune to work across a number of industries and sectors, including the private sector, in compliance, legal, and operations. And as we're focused on talking about life overseas, my current country count is at 7.
Impressive indeed. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here. We're honored to have you both. I think that many of us think about what it would be like to be an expat. It has some intrigue and even some seems romantic. But I'm sure, just like business travel, that when you've done it enough, there are some aspects that are not so fabulous. And we don't often think about reentry when we're enthralled with packing our bags to live overseas. So first, can you tell us something you wish you knew before you got on the plane? Joy, since this is most recent for you, in retrospect, what do you wish you knew or thought about beforehand?
Sure. On the one hand, there are a few things I wish I knew about products that would be hard to find here so that I could bring them. There are things like brown sugar and chili packs with the balance of spices that I like. But on the other hand, that's part of the adventure of immersing yourself in another culture. A big part of that is food. So I've changed how I eat and how I cook. There are a million varieties of really delicious, high quality dairy products that I've never seen before, many of which I still haven't tried. And so it's just exciting to be like, that's new. And I'm going to try that out, cooking with it, eating it as is. making that adjustment, I think, is part of what I was excited about doing. But the initial move is so stressful, and there's so much that's unfamiliar at the very beginning that maybe having a few of those comfort items to kind of get me through that transition might have been a choice that I would make. I think on a different point, not necessarily something I didn't know or I wish I knew, but something that I didn't expect was how lonely I would feel during the election. Everybody around me was aware of it and they were interested. The level of interest was much higher than the level of interest I've seen in the US for an election outside of the US. But understandably, most of my colleagues observed it more with interest than with the sense of hope or the sense of concern that most Americans would. And of course, it was personal for me in a way that it wasn't for them. On the one hand, that made for a much less tense environment. And I love hearing the huge variety of perspectives and insights that my colleagues bring. On the other hand, I guess I learned something about myself when I noticed that I found it really difficult to be separated from that shared sense of personal investment in our country's future leadership. So, again, not so much something I wish I knew, but part of what's cool about living in a different culture is you learn something about yourself as you see how you land in a different environment.
Great. And Gitanjali, do you have any I wish I knew items?
Absolutely. So items, not so much, but lessons, things that I learned from these experiences. I think for me, the first is finding balance with expectations. When you go abroad, the first thing that you start to notice are the comparisons, and you start to make contrasts with what was life in the US and and the new country that you're in. So whether that's navigating culture or language or the practicalities of living abroad or food, to Joy's point, or workplace culture, it's different because that's how it's supposed to be. It's another country. And yes, of course, there is that romanticism of wanting a new experience, but when you get there, you're obviously got to navigate that leap and that confrontation that you have to get out of your comfort zone. I think in my first few experiences abroad, I wish I understood that earlier, because it did really take a few bumps along the road to adapt and to figure out that if I accept my new environment as it is, I could enjoy it, I could grow to love it, and I could thrive. And the second thing I would say is to make sure that self care is a priority. So, whether it is, yes, you've got things that you brought along with you as a semblance of some comfort, living abroad definitely brings on this dynamic where you can very easily find yourself putting more effort to prove yourself in the workplace. And for me, that resulted in an increased workload, longer hours, kind of filling up time with work to the expense of my self care. So while, yeah, I was moving up by moving away, and that had a nice impact on my compensation. Again, I wish I knew earlier in my career to be more intentional about self-care, whether that was making sure that I had routines ready to dive into, finding activities to feel grounded. I think knowing how to maintain your sense of self while adapting to a new environment, it's tricky, but it's also the most fulfilling part, I would say, about living abroad.
And for me, my current company is headquartered in London. My prior one, just because I want to get onto the Switzerland train because I love the train so much in Switzerland. I'm only there for a week or two at a time, and in London, and it's maybe annual. When I was in Zurich, I used to go every couple months, and I had a great experience. But I'm sure it's very different, even when I was there more, because I was coming back to the US. What do you think are the biggest differences from my type of short jaunts and you for being there for a couple of years or more?
So for me, this last stretch of being abroad was about 14 years in this one go. So the biggest differences for me come down to the depth of the experience, the level of adjustment that you're going to face, and the impact on your day to day life. Doing these short jaunts or doing a business trip, I think you're really seeing It's a bit more of a surface exploration. You're going to tourist sites, you're having popular experiences, you're going to nice restaurants. It's a little bit curated, your cultural view, and you're getting snapshots, but you're definitely not getting the full picture. When you're there for a year more and it just starts to rack up in the time that you spend, you start to go beyond that surface into cultural immersion, right? And that's where personal transformation comes about, where growth comes from, where connections come from. And you really start to experience this real rhythm of life. What are local traditions? What are everyday routines? The seasonal changes, even the political cycles that go on in those countries, not just viewing them of your own home country from afar, but then also the social norms that exist within your host country. So I think you're gaining deeper insights into culture, values, perspectives. You also have to confront a lot of your own assumptions. I mean, for me, every year that I spent, it was like a reevaluation of my priorities. But I also gained a stronger sense of independence, a stronger sense of adaptability, and that growth for me was profound. It stays with you, it changes you. I mean, it changed me.
Yeah, that
Joy?
makes a lot of sense. I think I have some that are sort of along the same theme. I've only been here for 3.5 months now, but I think the major difference between residing here and the visits that I had beforehand at work is my presence is no longer special. It's just business as usual. People drop by my desk like it's no big deal because it isn't. And I'm right there in the flow of information and activity, and it just feels natural. And you're not just getting those snapshots, you're part of day to day life. Today, I volunteered at our Bring Your Kids to Work Day, and I saw parents bring their kids into work, which is kind of a snapshot, but it's not necessarily one that I would have gotten on a work trip. Certainly
Mm,
not participating like that. I participated in a volunteer event that my work organized for a local soup kitchen, and we fed over 250 people a hot meal. And I got to observe the differences between that and the United States, and that here. Geneva is an interesting place because there are so many different cultures that I don't even know that French is necessarily the totally dominant language. It's what you would speak in the grocery and things like that. But in the soup kitchen, I heard at least 4 languages: French, German, Italian, Russian, English. So just really interesting to have those deeper cultural experiences that you wouldn't get on the tourist trip or on a business trip where people are trying to make the most of your time. And so they're curating what you get in a way
mm.
that you really miss something that allows you to be an effective compliance professional.
That's great. I understand that when you think about being an expat, there's some things about taxes and visas that can be tricky. And you really need to think about your compensation pretty carefully. To me, some countries are trickier than others, but are there any tips you could share with our listeners to be aware of? Then I'll start with you, Joy, because it's more recent for you.
It is fresh, but I have not been through a tax season yet, so I'm still learning. But I obviously did a ton of research before I accepted the offer because taxes have a huge impact on evaluating the quality of this offer versus other alternatives that I had. The income tax rate is higher, the highest rate kicks in sooner. There's a wealth tax that varies based on what canton you're in, but there's no capital gains tax. There's a tax treaty between the US and Switzerland, but there are a lot of complexities. Both companies have complicated carve outs for what is and isn't taxed. My husband and I spent many hours researching all of this before I accepted the job. And we're hiring a tax consultant to both help us with the financial planning aspect of it and also the tax returns. So a little bit TBD on what I find out there, but I did weigh it out so that I could understand, was I at least going to break even or move up in terms of my capacity to save for retirement.
Yeah. And Gitanjali, what was your experience?
Yeah, I think what Joy mentioned, doing that research, it's so critical. What I ended up doing from every country that I lived in, I created like a playbook what are all those practicalities that you need to navigate? And then I would share them with friends proactively who I knew were going to go through the same experience, whether on arrival into the country or on departure. Yes, every country has its different regime and sort of visa types for expats, everything ranging from short term to long term, what it would take for you to get residency, if that's something that you're considering. Visas, you can obviously get them through your employer if they're large enough and will go that mile to do. But part of that research is also understanding the terms of your visa and the renewal process and what you can do while you're living there. For example, can you own property? What will happen to your property when you leave? Can you change jobs when you're on that visa? What happens if you lose your job? Some countries will offer sort of special taxation schemes for expats that might be at a reduced rate. Some countries will also have special regimes for your pension. Being US citizens, if you are thinking about going abroad, you will also be dealing with dual taxation. So think about that because you are going to have to still file in the US. The US does tax on your worldwide income. I had the joy when I lived in Denmark that Denmark also taxed on worldwide incomes. You're between two places of wanting every penny from you. And then think research also, what are those filing requirements? I mean, if we think and laugh about the IRS being complex, try doing it in another country's system in a foreign language. Yeah. So I think, Joy, you did that's great advice. I also had gotten a tax consultant before I accepted the offer. I actually negotiated for that so that I could understand what my tax impact was going to be. And I would also suggest hiring a tax accountant to do your taxes because when you're having to do dual tax two sets of returns, they're just some things that like TurboTax can't even figure out for you.
Yeah, thinking about that from your reception from the tax authorities to the reception for some of your colleagues, you had talked earlier about that you were there in the longer term, so you have these additional experiences. Did you feel welcomed? Do you feel generally welcomed, or was this more of a short-term thing where at a certain point somebody would just look over and say, "Wait, you're still here"? And how did it go with that? Gitanjali, let's start with you.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, every country that I lived in and every organization is a little bit different in terms of what that employer, what that country sort of gets in terms of like expats coming in and out, right? So in some, there might be then this unspoken perception that, okay, you're a foreign colleague, you're not going to stay for long. And yes, you're viewed maybe as this short timer. But, a few ways to kind of counter that perception is to find a peer, find a local mentor, somebody in your organization that can help you navigate the workplace norms because you're trying to understand what's the structure, what does your operating environment look like? Who and how do others get invested in the company goals? How are you going to be able to impart this unique knowledge that you've been hired to bring on to demonstrate your expertise and contribute your value? All of that, you still need to overcome some of those initial outsider impressions. So I would say if the company organizes events to engage their workforce, consider participating. Every opportunity helps kind of shake some of those perceptions and assumptions that your colleagues are also making of you, that you're not there for a short period of time. You actually are interested in getting to know them and how the organization operates. So I would say it takes time for colleagues to become friendly. It takes even longer to get integrated. So patience is definitely key to building trust and familiarity.
Interesting.
What?
I have some contrasting experience here because I'm not one American in an environment of largely Swiss people. It is very multicultural in
Mhm.
my office. So there isn't one kind of dominant culture where I have to think, what are the cultural norms in this one office? My husband worked in Germany for 3 years. And before I moved here, he warned me that in a lot of Europe, it's rude to put your hands below the table at mealtime. And I got fixated on that and all these other things like, oh my gosh, what if I accidentally offend somebody because I don't know some custom?
Mm.
And I'm observing all around me. I've got, people from all over the world. And I think because of that, there's not one custom that everybody expects everybody else to follow. There's not one way of doing things. So really the adjustment for me is just like I would do in the US, but maybe amplified, being observant of how my actions land and the huge variety of customs and perspectives that I'm interacting with, and seek to understand when things don't land in the way that I expect.
Hmm.
Um, and then I think more broadly in Switzerland, so not at work, I just try to be observant of the local customs. So number one, I'm always going to try to speak French in the beginning.
Mhm.
Frequently people will switch to English when they see that I'm struggling, but I think they appreciate that I make an effort. In Switzerland, quiet hours are a huge deal. Nights and Sundays, you're supposed to be quiet, and that's down to don't operate noisy appliances like washers and dryers, vacuums. It is seriously quiet hours. Reading about these things, being observant, asking questions, and then applying those customs and really making an effort at speaking the language. So it's a little bit of a different story about what it looks like to fit in my company on the one hand, and then in Geneva more broadly on the other hand.
That's a perfect segue to kind of the next question, which you both have kind of hit on is how much of a barrier is language and culture? You see some of these job postings that say English is fine, second language a plus. And I suspect you'll share your point of view on this, but at work, probably English goes better because there are more English speakers, but at the grocery store, probably not. But Tanjali, how important is it really to have at least some working ability of the language in for the country that you're in?
Yeah. So I would say language can be a barrier and it can make some of the simplest activities challenging. So while yes, in job descriptions you may see that English is fine, it's the predominant working language. Wherever you are located, there will be colleagues that will still speak in the language of the host country. Yeah. So you will find yourself isolated in those or isolated or excluded from those conversations if you don't speak the language as well. And that's something to, as I kind of mentioned earlier, it will be a difference and it will be how it's supposed to be because people will resort to talking in a language that they're the most comfortable in. And if it's the language of the host country, you can't fault them for reverting to speak in that language, even if English is the working language. Yeah. Your meetings will still be conducted in English. Regular business trading transactions will also be conducted in English. But I think if you consider staying on longer, or to Joy's point, like making the effort to speak French, I also hired a tutor when I lived in Switzerland, even after like my years of studying French in school as a child. As an adult, no, nothing came out the way that I wanted to express it. So I hired a tutor, and it'll go down to how motivated are you? How deep do you actually want to get? There will be communities that will be more accessible to you if you choose to stay within a place of comfort where you will be around expats. But if you really want to get truly immersed with locals and local culture, speaking the language is a tremendous asset. Yeah. On the other side, the longer time that you spend in a country, you will pick up the subtleties, you will pick up the idioms, you will pick up body language. It will help you navigate. I mean, I knew how to operate reading a menu, engaging in the grocery store, dealing with doctors, dealing with like the practicalities of day-to-day life. And I wasn't fluent in Danish, and nor would I profess to have any degree of expertise. But it can also be a interesting and fun experience, but you don't know the language. I mean, I've also taken every type of exercise class in a language I don't understand. And you can figure out, okay, they mean downward dog. I can do downward dog in whatever language I'm being taught in.
Excellent. And Joy, clearly you speak some French, so that's great. But do you find that the language can be a barrier?
To me, it's really important to be part of the community that I live in. I want to get to know people. It feels polite to be able to engage with people in the language of the country. Going to the doctor. I mean, I'm going to live here for years. That is going to be a thing. Volunteering when people ask for a specific dish or something like that. I go out hiking. People ask me for directions. So there are a few basic things I have learned to say in French. I can ask for and I can give directions. I can order. I can't speak medical French by any means, but it's also fun in Geneva. There's so many different languages. One of my favorite stories is actually one of the first few weeks when I was there, I was in the line at a bank and there was an older gentleman who I think was retired and just trying to make conversation. And so he says a bunch of stuff that I don't understand. And I said, Désolé, je parle un peu français. Sorry, I only speak a little French. And he says, Espanol? And I had said, No, no, anglais et russe, English and Russian. And he said, Я говорю немного по-русски. I speak a little Russian. So he was very excited to just speak to somebody, making conversation in the line. And a young girl behind me goes, Oh my gosh, I speak Russian too. So the three of us just start making conversation about how we learned Russian and where we went and things like that. So, one really cool thing that feels probably pretty unique to Geneva is you can have three strangers at all spectrums of the age group find a common language and just make conversation. So I do want to learn French, but it's been really cool to refresh my Russian as well and just get to know a huge variety of people that come from all over the place. So just a little bit of a cultural anecdote, but
Yeah, what a beautiful story. Now let's switch a little bit to the journey home and thinking about that. So this is more recent for you, Gitanjali and Joy. We don't know. You said years over there, so I don't know when you're coming home. But I think reentry can be difficult, right? Because you're switching back and you have an expectation that things are what they were, right? Like this, like somehow it was frozen in time, and then you come back and things have changed. So talk about that adjustment and how hard, how easy. What are the things on the flip side you wish you had thought about or you knew before you got on the plane home?
Mhm. Absolutely. I think after years of being away, home definitely takes on a completely different meaning. So even though I had made this choice to return back to the US, my home country, I think it was really when I got here that first month where I felt even more tied to the places that I had lived in before coming back. And I think I was also kind of overwhelmed a bit by how much I had adapted to parts of each country and the culture that became a part of me. So returning home definitely did bring on reverse culture shock. And that's because I realized just how much my perspective had changed. And so it is real to feel this culture shock. I think places that I sort of quickly jumped and started like scrounging around in my toolbox for was like, what am I going to need to be able to navigate this transition? What had helped me before, just like I would have moved to any of the other countries. And for me, that was gaining support from my networks. So before I had moved back, I had already made sure well enough in advance that I had started to reconnect with friends that I had here. I think Lisa, I had reached out to you. We had had some chats. We talked about neighborhoods in DC. Ellen, you were instrumental in me choosing DC, first off, but also different communities and networks to start tapping into and people to meet. And making sure that I had routines that we talked about at the outset. So some of those lessons that I wish I had learned earlier on, again, being part of my toolbox, I made sure that I had routines. Just took my foot sort of off the pedal of this freak out stage and said, I need to just be patient. I need to trust that all this growth and resilience means that I can find my way even back home in my home country. Yeah,
Are you
I think
glad you're back?
I am 100% glad that I'm back.
Thank you for sharing so much of your journeys and what you've been through with us. And definition of home often changes. And I really do love that you've also given us both practical tips and really things to think about our everyday lives and what we're doing. And before we sign off, is there any other parting thoughts that you think anyone that you'd want to share with our listeners, whether they're thinking of going abroad or coming home? And that, because we have a global audience, may mean different things to different people. Joy?
Sure. Yeah. I think one thing that came out when I was negotiating, kind of in my recognition of what I needed to go for, is Geneva is one of the most expensive cities in the world. And so when I compared the cost of living in Geneva to the cost of living in Gainesville, Florida, it's more than double. And so I was, where do I need to end up to break even? And initially my head defaulted to my pay needs to more than double. But then it sunk in, I don't spend all my money. So really what I need to think about is, how much can I save after my expected expenditures, which are
Mhm.
a portion of how much I earn. And so what I came up with as the break even point was what allows me to save as much or more after my expenditures, which are going to go up a lot, but also just the quality of life kind of differences, right? I might just forget how to drive because I get to take the bus and train everywhere. That's pretty cool to me. I don't love driving. So to be able to have somebody else take care of that for me is wonderful. I'm taking a last minute trip to Venice for a long weekend for 150 franc plane ticket and just not a lot of time off. It's just over an hour flight. Geneva itself is wonderful, but I can get all of these wonderful
Mhm.
places very quickly, really good food, really good medical care. So just kind of balancing all those things around quality of life along with the financial negotiation package. And then I think the thing I would emphasize, as much as the financial prep for getting ready to leave, is thinking about how you keep in touch with family and friends. I have a lot of my friends used to text me a lot to keep in touch. I do have an app that allows that to happen, but it has been extremely glitchy. And so I may not get texts. So I've tried to kind of train them to start using WhatsApp, for instance, but just kind of getting people to make what adjustments are required to keep in touch with you, thinking about how you can meet them in the middle in terms of time zones. But that's what's most important, is staying connected with those friends and family. And it is tricky. I mean, it's easier than ever with technology. The time zones make it difficult. So just planning for that, I think, is really important.
Mm.
Gitanjali?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Joy brought up a lot of great points. I think I would just add that definitely do a lot of research. And if you don't know exactly where you want to pursue your international career, take that time to choose that country that fits your adventure. Yeah. I would say many countries are still on the far side of the gender gap. Many countries offer very different working environments, styles, expectations that'll be different from, what you may know. Not to let that stop you, but that's where I would say reach out to expats that are living in that country you're thinking about, because they have a wealth of knowledge and they can help you get acclimated to your surroundings. Some of the best guidance and resources I got were through friends and people I didn't know, friends of friends that were living in countries that could help me find these information sources. Reach out to other women, leverage your network, start to establish that community before you go. So you've already got some people to have dinner with on your first night when you arrive. A position, I think, overseas requires a lot of patience, and it's going to definitely have a slow learning curve, but I think the rewards are incredible. So I know most people you may get advice around saying, what's the worst that can happen by going overseas? I think I would definitely flip that and say, what's the best that can happen? And go for that.
I love that positivity. Thank you so much for talking with us. And Ellen, thank you so much for bringing us all together. And thanks to the GWIC community for listening in. If inspires you or you want to share it with somebody else, please take advantage of the LinkedIn GWIC group to learn more about this. And a special thanks to our guests. So on behalf of Ellen, me, WIC and the Compliance Podcast Network. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day.